Hello and welcome back to the Maverick Life podcast, the podcast that is dedicated to helping you live the life that you really want to live, where you want to live it, doing what you want to do, with whom you want to do. And today I'm joined by another fellow Australian. So, you can trust him, Paul from Plan B, Paraguay. We are going to talk all things international living, the Maverick life, and the Maverick life, particularly in Paraguay. Quick disclaimer, guys, nothing we say is financial, tax advice, living advice, marriage advice, nothing of that. It's just two blokes having a chat. Take out of it what you will. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul from Plan B Paraguay. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to share Paraguay with the world. So let's get into it.
Let's get into it, mate. Let's get straight in. Give us maybe a two-minute synopsis on you and your background, because you're, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
a fellow Aussie. How does an
Mm.
Aussie find himself in Paraguay?
Yeah, I would say prior to Paraguay, my life was pretty boring. I worked, basically just had a government job for 10 years, if you can believe it, in a row. And during that time, I found out about crypto and what a good investment was. And I thought, okay, this is going somewhere. So I literally, for like a few years, I lived basically every dollar I had, I put into crypto, right? You know, copped a lot of abuse from my friends about how cheap I am, like, what are you doing? Spend some money and all that. But it turned out all right in the end. And it got into the point where I had enough money where, okay, I didn't necessarily want to stay in Australia. I wanted a nicer country, a cheaper country to live where I could potentially retire. And that's how I ended up moving to Paraguay. Well, anyway, last year, if you follow crypto at all, you might know that our fortunes changed in terms of the markets, and crypto really had a bit of a dip. So at that time, I was like, okay, maybe it's time to start looking into starting a business over here. And I just knew, like, coming to Paraguay, it was such like an unexplored gem. No one was talking about it. People talk about like Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, like all that stuff, but no one was talking about Paraguay. I was like, this is like too good, this country. This is going to be huge one day. And I want to create a business around inviting people to this country. And just over a year ago, now that's when we created Plan B Paraguay. It was with myself and another fellow Aussie that moved over here at the same time.
That is Maverick as a government employee that's investing in crypto and moves to Paraguay. Oh my God, this is why I love doing. I love doing this. So, how many years did you live in your job before you decided to move to Paraguay? And are you based in Asunción?
Yeah, so it all started where I was just, like a typical, just like awful day at the office where you're like wasting time while your boss isn't in the room. And I was just like, Googling like early retirement online. And I remember reading some article. It was like retire in Costa Rica for 200,000 US dollars. And I didn't have 200,000 US dollars at the time, but that was like, okay, it started putting in my mind the idea you can go to a country like a continent like South America, and with a lot less money that you need in, say, a place like Australia, you could retire and just just live the type of life you want to live. So that's sort of what kicked it off. And yes, I live in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay.
Okay, very, very interesting, my man. So, how does it work when you arrive to Paraguay? And all Paul's business details will be in the description, guys. So if it sounds interesting to you, you can get in touch and ask him questions there on a more personal basis. But you arrive in Paraguay, can you get in just on a 90-day tourist visa, and then you like it so much you decide to stay? And what does that involve? Talk us through the process of going from tourist to permanent resident.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about the process of, let's say, one of your viewers wants to move to Paraguay. Either they want to live in Paraguay or they want to keep the residency as a plan B, which is another option a lot of people use that we can talk about. So first off, you basically need the good thing about Paraguay, I should say, is that it's still one of the easiest residencies to get in the world, right? So you'll see when I go through the requirements. Basically, you need your birth certificate and you need a clean criminal record check. Like something minor, like a drunk driving or something like that, they'll let it go. But anything more intense than that, I'm sorry, Paraguay's not going to accept you. But once you have those two things, you need to get something called an apostille put on them. So an apostille is basically a stamp that your government will put on the documents that lets another government like Paraguay accept those documents. So your birth certificate, criminal record check, they both get an apostille. And then effectively, you're basically good to go, right? If you're using a service like ours, what you'll do is you'll send us images, scans of your documents. We'll make sure it's all good. And then once we give you the okay, you can fly to Asuncion. So all the residencies, all the applications, you have to come to Asuncion, which is the capital, to do that. Now, we usually want people to come here about 5 days. During that time, you know, we like pick you up from the airport, take you to your hotel, set you up with a SIM card, and then we take you to all your government appointments. Usually it's just 2 days. It's stuff like your fingerprints, photos being taken, you know, signing documents saying that, you know, you're going to be a good resident, you're not going to do anything silly in Paraguay. And then after that, you sort of have two options, right? It takes about 9 weeks for when you submit your stuff to when they're ready for you to collect. And you can either just start living in Paraguay and start your new life in Paraguay after that time period. Or let's say, you know, you want to return to your country or you want to keep traveling, we can just send you your documents when they're ready. Now, the main thing that people receive is they receive two things. They receive a temporary residency. So it's a 2-year residency you'll get in Paraguay, and that's how everyone starts. And you also receive the Cédula ID, which is like the national ID card. So our service, and I guess most services, will give you those two things after that.
Okay, excellent. And so with regards to the temporary 2-year residency, then converting into permanent residency, what's the physical presence requirement in those first 2 years? How long do I have to be in the country in order to meet all the requirements to eventually become a permanent resident after that?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because a lot of countries do have, you know, you have to be X number of months a year. For the temporary residency requirement, there's no minimum time in country requirement. For the permanent residency, it's 1 day a year. That's what it says in the law. However, what we find is very few people in the past, we've noticed, have actually lost their residency for even meeting that requirement. So like the law says 1 day a year, but you know, if you accidentally miss a year or not, there's a good chance no one will notice.
That's what we all love about South America. Okay, very, very interesting. So let's talk about how much does this cost? Is this an investment, a residency via investment program, or is it starting a local company and then hiring yourself as an employee kind of deal? Talk me through what are my options if I wanted to become a resident of Paraguay, hypothetically speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not previously, before November last year, you used to have to put $5,000 in a local bank account here. And what's crazy about Paraguay is where that $5,000 came from is the Paraguayan government had a rule that you needed to have 36 months of minimum wage here, right? So the government believes that you could live off $5,000 for 3 years here. Now, Paraguay is cheap. I don't know if it's that cheap, but I always thought that was funny. That seems to scrap that requirement. So it's really just, you know, the lawyer's fees or using a service like ours. Now, obviously, we do a lot more for you, and we're a lot more hands-on, so we're probably a little bit more expensive than other services. But I mean, each service would have their own price in regards to that.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in further details, please do get in contact with Paul and the team. And I will say, so I have different passports, different residencies. I had a very bad experience with a residency, not in Paraguay, but in a neighboring, not quite a neighboring country. And guys, I tried to do everything right. It's just so much easier to use a local trusted contact that has already done the groundwork for you and already figured out who is good and who is bad. So please, if you are interested in this sort of thing, make sure you don't be cheap about it. You hire the professionals and let them go to work for you. So that's really interesting. In terms of Paraguay itself, I've never been. Describe it to me. Is there a big difference in terms of one part of the country to the next? What is it in particular about the Paraguayan lifestyle that has led you to call it your home?
Yeah, absolutely. So, firstly, to answer the first part of your question, Paraguay, it's a small country. It's around 7 million people. Yeah. And Asuncion, the capital, has about 2 million. The next biggest city, Ciudad de Este, has about 500,000 people, right? So besides really the capital, Asuncion, it's a very sort of rural type country. I would say there is variety. Asuncion's kind of like a modern, sort of bustling Latin American city. And then besides that, like it's real rural. It's going back to like the 1970s or something when you get out into, they call it the Chaco, like it's like our version of the outback for Australians. It's pretty interesting out there. It's pretty wild. But yeah, so I'd say there's a slight difference between whether you want to live in the city or if you want to live like in the rural areas. So in terms of Paraguay, yes, I would say it's a very distinct culture. It's even very distinct from other countries in South America. So I figure, how about talk about like what I see as the pros and what I see as the cons, so that your audience can get a better idea.
Let's do it.
So the main thing that's really different about Paraguay is, I would say, the level of personal freedom. Like lots of Latin American countries have, usually they're pretty relaxed, they're pretty chill about stuff, but I'd say Paraguay's on a whole other level. Like generally, as long as you're not really hurting or annoying someone else here, you can pretty much, do what you want. Yeah. And for me, like coming from a country like Australia, where you just feel like rule upon rule upon rule, like do this, you can't do that, being treated like a child effectively by the government, just to come to a country where you can sort of be free and do what you want. It's very liberating in that regard. And so like, yeah, just to like, for example, it's a silly example, but like in Paraguay, effectively, there's no speed limit. Yeah. The speed limit is what you can safely drive, and it's funny, I got a girlfriend now, she went to France and she hired a car over there and she was driving and she got pulled over by the cops for speeding. And she was so confused because she never heard the concept of like, like a speed limit before. And so, like it's mixed bag, right? Because in some ways, it's a little bit more rough, it's a little bit more wild. But if you're the type of person that likes that, you really enjoy it. The second thing I would say is, in general, Latinos are pretty friendly people, but I'd say Paraguayans are like even more friendly. Like the culture here is like people are very calm, they're very friendly, they tend to like talk quietly, they walk slowly, but it's just a whole different vibe. I used to live in Melbourne in Australia, and that's like a big city. And I realized after like a month of coming here, I started just like chill out and like relax a bit. And I was thinking about it, and I think like as humans, we subconsciously like pick up on like the body language of everyone around us, right? And because in Paraguay everyone's chill and they're calm, like it starts to rub off on you a little bit, and you start to like slow down a little bit, which I think has been I really enjoyed that. Then obviously like Paraguay is also known for having very favorable taxes. So the local tax rate is quite low, and then it is a territorial tax country. So if you do have a foreign source of income as your main, if you earn money from a foreign source and you're a Paraguayan tax resident, you won't owe taxes in Paraguay. So that's quite attractive to certain people, especially if you run an online business, you're a digital nomad, that sort of thing. The other thing that, because Paraguay is sort of like a low tax country, it's quite a conservative, quite a right-wing sort of libertarian country. And so what this tends to do is like basically if you come here, there's no like living off the government or just like slacking or whatever. Like everyone that comes here, they have to work or you're not going to eat, right?
And
And
this is
so
coming
what's
from a former government employee, guys.
I know, right? I'm such a hypocrite. Yeah. I'm such a hypocrite, and I accept that. It's true. It's
You know,
true.
you are
I'm not
converted, my
proud of what I
friend.
was.
You are converted, my child.
That's right. Yeah, I'm free. But what's interesting as an expat, right, is basically your whole network. Yeah, is basically only guys that run online businesses or they're entrepreneurs. Like I know a guy that's like a poker player. I know just all sorts of interesting things, right? And it's kind of cool having your whole social group as entrepreneurs, like entrepreneurship, online business, making money just seems normal. Yeah. So like I said, I was like the government employee, not particularly entrepreneurial, I'm going to be honest, but just being around that and it sort of rewires your brain a little bit. And you're like, oh, you know, it is possible. Like it's not earning money online, isn't some like pie in the sky impossible thing. You see all your friends do it in a different way. And I think that's really good. The other thing I like about it is the country is like growing like rapidly. Yeah. So I'd say recently in South America, there's been a lot of like left-wing governments and a lot of people are worried about their personal wealth, particularly in places like Argentina and Brazil, and they're fleeing. Yeah. So they're taking their money out of that and they're investing in a place like Paraguay where they see the government's more conservative, more fiscally responsible. And for that reason, there's a really big boom here. And you're seeing the country is modernizing quickly. The standard of living is improving, people are getting wealthier. So there's kind of that optimism in the air. And like you can contrast that against a lot of like Western countries where, you know, where things like, it feels like things are getting worse every year in a lot of countries, you know, for various reasons. And it's just so nice to be in a country where it feels like things are getting better. Yeah, then the other thing I'd say that's kind of cool, especially for me, I'm a little bit older than you, looking by how much hair you got relative to me. But
Most of
eventually I
it's
want to have a
grey.
family. Sorry?
Most of it's grey. Don't worry.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay. It's not coming up on the camera. It's looking pretty good. And like here, it's like you can actually have a family and you can have like a lot of kids and it's affordable. Like in Australia, you need to be like 6 figures like plus
At
to
least.
have
Yeah.
yeah, you know, after like childcare, schooling, housing, all that stuff. Like just an anecdote, like a friend of mine recently had his first child, yeah, in Paraguay. And they've hired like a full-time nanny, lives with them, helps the mother out, takes the stress off her shoulders, and they're paying her like what would it be? We'll do US dollars because you've got an international audience. It'd
Mhm.
be about $800 a month,
Wow.
you know, and just yeah, and just think about that. And like just to be able to like just have like schooling cheap, like everything cheap and accessible, you can have a big family, which I think is something that not many people talk about, but that's kind of been slowly taken away from us in the West.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We really have, in most of the OECD countries, robbed that future generation with fiscal irresponsibility and affordability of living, and you know, particularly in Melbourne, where housing costs, you know, 8 or 9 times the average annual income. And I question the average annual income. And no, it's a really important point that you make. I'm going to put forth a few myths that I see out there, and you're going to tell me whether they're true or false. Speaking
Let's
of
go for it.
families and Paraguay and differences between other countries, I've heard it said that since the war, Paraguay's started a few wars in its day. It lost a large number of the male population, and so all the passport bros are thinking to themselves, "Oh, I'm going to go to Paraguay, where it's like 7 women to 1 man, and the odds are in
Right,
my favor. I've got no game in my home country, but if I go to Paraguay, things are going to magically
right.
change for me." Talk me through that idea.
Yeah.
Is there
Let
any truth to it?
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit. So, it was called in English, the War of the Triple Alliance. Yeah, Paraguay used to be a lot bigger, a lot more of a powerful country. And at the time that there was a dictator running the country, and he thought it was a good idea to try and go to war with Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay all at the same time. And they basically, they waged this war. They didn't surrender until they say there was only 10% of the male population
Jesus Christ.
remaining in Paraguay. And so there was a definitely a time in the recent history where there was, yeah, like they say like 7 women to 1 man, you know? So it probably would have been a good time to be a guy in Paraguay at that time. So anyway, obviously, you know, like basic biology, the genders are balanced now, right? However, what I think that's happened, and I think it did permanently change Paraguayan culture, where it seems like Paraguayan men can get away with more than you could in other countries, whether like in general, let's say Paraguayan men, perhaps they're a little bit less faithful. They probably don't put as much effort into their appearance or maybe being like the best partner as other people do. And then as a consequence, I would say like, whether it's just culture, it's passed down the women, you know, they try, I'd say, a lot harder to keep a man happy. They make sure they maintain their appearance. And that says today, there's like this famous meme in Paraguay, right? And it's like of this beautiful Latina woman just like bawling her eyes out, yeah. And then in Spanish it says, "This is the guy she's crying about," and it's like this like fat, like disgusting, like Latino looking dude, you know. And I'd say to an extent that stereotype is true, and it still persists to this day.
Okay, very, very, very interesting. If earlier in our conversation you mentioned Ciudad del Este, I've heard some very,
Ooh,
very interesting things about this city.
okay.
Situated on the border, and on the border, there's obviously lots of traffic in, out, and otherwise, and various
Mm,
things that may or may not be trafficked. Have you been to Ciudad del
mm.
Este, and how safe is that city compared to the rest of Paraguay?
Yeah, so okay. First, in general, Paraguay is pretty safe. They say it's the 3rd safest country in South America. Only Uruguay and Chile, which are like wealthy
Really?
countries, are safer. Yeah. So that said, Ciudad del Este does have a little bit of a reputation. You're right, it's right on the border of Brazil and Paraguay. What's really interesting and crazy about this border is that it's an open border. Yeah. So you can literally, and I've done it, there's a bridge there. You can just walk from Paraguay to Brazil, nobody cares. You know, you can catch a motorcycle over whatever. Now, officially, if you go deeper into Brazil or deeper into Paraguay, you're supposed to present at the immigration, right? But both of those cities on the border, as long as you stay in those cities, officially, you know, you don't need to, yeah, you don't need to go through immigration. And so because it has this easy access effectively, where as long as you don't show up immigration, no one's going to notice, it is known as a route for various things between each country. Now, in terms of crime, I'd say there's not particularly the crime that happens there, but I imagine, you know, there is some sort of transit of, let's say, illicit substances, and that's probably crime in other places. You know, Brazil, I find, is quite a bit more dangerous than Paraguay. So there'd be a little bit of, you know, effects from the whatever it is, illicit substances in Brazil. In general, what's interesting about Paraguay and like narcos and drugs is that there's not really many narcos in Paraguay, and it's for 2 reasons. First, in general, Paraguayans are poor. You know, they want to sell like coke to rich Americans. Yeah, you're not going to try and traffic coke or anything to poor people. Secondly, Paraguay's not on the route to America. You know, all the countries that are on the route to United States, they're going to have problems. We're nice, we're in the middle, no one cares about us, and for that reason, there's a little bit of organized crime, like you said, on that border, but in general, there's very little in the country.
That's a very interesting point, because it's essentially landlocked. There's no port as such where you would see a large amount of volumes. So yeah, it's almost like a second Uruguay, but in the middle, almost, I won't say a Switzerland of South America. It's obviously not a
Oh,
great
don't
continent.
insult Paraguay by calling us Uruguay. Okay, I
All
got
right, I'm sorry.
strong opinions about Uruguay. Um, but it does have some resemblances with Uruguay. Yeah, it's a small country. Uruguay's not landlocked though. They obviously have their
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so um, let's talk about Paraguayan Spanish, and I guess
Yeah.
the genetics of the average Paraguayo is. Are we talking a fairly standard Spanish, or is it very
Mm,
different? What's the
yeah.
Spanish like in Paraguay?
Yeah, so I'll tell kind of a little a funny story of history, and to all the don't fact check me too hard. This is what I heard, okay? But this is basically how it went down. Again, there was another dictator a few hundred years ago, and he had these sort of utopian ideas about, how life should be, how people should live, that sort of thing. And he had this rule that he made at the time that people weren't allowed to marry people of their own race. So if you were from Spanish descent, you had to marry an indigenous person. If you were an indigenous person, you had to marry someone from Spanish descent. So for
Interesting.
this reason, so Paraguay, like today, is like, besides immigrants like myself, it's like 98% mestizo. So and so you see, it's not like other parts of South America where you might see people who are definitely more indigenous, people who are definitely more Spanish. Everyone's mestizo here. And so that's kind of the look of the normal Paraguayan person. Obviously with social class, at least appears to me in the wealthy areas, perhaps people are a little bit more European looking, and then poorer areas, people are perhaps a bit more indigenous. But that's how it breaks down.
Interesting.
The second thing is, the indigenous people are called the Guarani people here. Yeah.
Okay.
And when the Spanish arrived, the Guarani, just like Paraguayans today, were quite friendly. Yeah. And unlike, it's sad to say, in other places in South America, like Argentina, there was no sort of genocide or anything here. The Spanish intermingled with the Guarani, and because it was so peaceful, the Guarani kept a lot of their culture and the language. So in Paraguay today still has two languages. It has Spanish and it has Guarani, and Guarani is still spoken in many different areas. Usually how it works is it's usually a percentage Guarani versus Spanish, depending on where you are. Like in Asuncion, it's almost completely Spanish, where they'll throw in a few little Guarani words. But then, as you go into more rural areas in the country, the percentage Guarani to Spanish gets a lot higher. And I remember when I was first here, I saw like the craziest interaction. I was at a bank and I was looking at a teller, right? And there was this guy from the country speaking like complete Guarani. And then there was this guy trying to speak to him in Spanish, yeah, and they couldn't understand each other. And I was like, you guys are from the same country, what's going on here? And it was just funny listening to them have this weird conversation where they couldn't understand each other. So how I would say it influences the Spanish is they sort of have a little bit of an accent that's influenced by the Guarani when they speak Spanish, and it can make it a little bit harder to understand originally. I mean, I didn't know much Spanish before I got here. I improved as I was here, but even I find as I go to Argentina or Colombia, I feel like my Spanish is like 20% better because it doesn't have that strong Paraguayan accent in the Spanish here, in other places like it does here.
Gotcha. Oh, that's I'm learning so much as we go. I think that's a wonderful thing about it speaks to the richness of the culture in Paraguay. So, okay, 98% mestizo. Um, in other places, such as Colombia, for instance, where you do have a huge mestizo population of Creoles, but you do have this scale of ethnicities from what they would consider black is African, and then you have morenito in the middle, and then you have like for someone to be white, they've got to be like us basically. Are there any
Mm.
African genes in Paraguay, or they just they're in Brazil, they're in Colombia, or they're in other places, but for whatever reason, Paraguayan
Yeah,
history?
so Paraguay didn't have a history of African slavery or anything, so there's no really native African people here. Usually, if you see someone of African descent in Paraguay, people will assume it's a Brazilian person.
Yeah.
But I mean, like the population, like on my day to day, I probably see maybe 10 foreign looking people a day. And in terms of someone from African descent, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. So there's not very many African descent people here.
Okay. Yeah, super interesting. In terms of, and we're touching on the demographics because it's really interesting. What's the average age of people in Paraguay?
You know, I like that you asked that, right? Because that really fascinated me, and not many people think about that. And so before I moved from Australia, I was like, what's the average age of Australia and what's the average age of Paraguay? So the average age of Australia is 38, and the average age of Paraguay is 28 years old. And, you know, when you come here, you see it, yeah, because it's just everyone's young. Like, just in general, you don't see older people, you know. And one of the benefits I think that's in the future is like, in a lot of Western countries, we have this like terrible population pyramid, you know, where there's too many older people for younger people to support them. Here,
Especially
like
in
the
Australia.
population pyramid's like a beautiful like pyramid, you know, like there's plenty of young people coming up to support the old people. Now, part of that is Paraguayans are a conservative country. It's one of the most religious, one of the most Catholic countries in South America. So there is that very large birth rate. You know, women have children young here and they have many children. So yeah, as you walk around, you really notice it.
And so that's culturally seen as a really good thing that rather than we see a lot of the mind viruses in the West of, you know, women are career orientated and whatnot, it's seen as a really good thing to have in a country, I suppose, where you can have one parent financially earning the bread and the other as a caretaker. Is that the cultural setup?
Yeah, absolutely. It's much more traditional where women want to have kids. They feel happy to be a mother. You know, there's not the Western thing where there's this whole pressure where they also have to have a career at the same time. We don't need to get into that. Like here, that's what a lot of my girlfriend has this quote, like she wants to be called like a mama of Asa. So it's like Asa is like the most prestigious private school here, American School of Asuncion, yeah?
Okay.
So like the thing that women aspire here is to be like these trendy, the trendy like mothers that take their kid to the expensive school and then they do their yoga and they have their coffee and they do their Pilates. And so they have this saying like mother of Asa, which means
Yeah.
that's like their goal.
Okay. Oh, that's great. And there's no shame put upon them for fulfilling what is a beautiful role. I really like that. So we've got a
I mean,
young
I would even say like, I would even soften it and I would say like, there's a lot of competition to settle down and have kids in South America as a woman, you know, and they definitely feel the women here, you know, I need to look my best. I need to secure a guy that's like got to look after me. And they're thinking about this, you know, by the time they're 30, you know, so there's really like they want to try and find a real good guy, settle down by the time they're 30. I hear that a lot here.
Okay, interesting. And so as a man, does that mean I really got to have my act together and if I do have my act together, that gives me a good chance of finding a high quality woman?
Yeah, I mean that's universal,
I
right?
know.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And at least until now, and like you talk about passport bros, right? And uh I there's not there's not like a bad reputation for expats here yet. You know, like I feel in some places like it's too close to the United States. Yeah. So every second guy's flying down to Medellin. There's too many expats, right? And you get this thing that I like to call like the parasitic class. So if there's too many expats in a certain part of South America, you start to have parasites. So these are the girls that, you know, they'll lie to you, try to drug you on Tinder. This is the people on the street trying to rip you off. This is the dodgy real estate deals. This is the dodgy taxis, all that stuff.
That's
Because
real.
there's so few expats in Paraguay, there's not enough, there's these people don't exist yet. Yeah, so there's a real sort of innocence around expats. They see it, like, I get asked here a lot, like, wow, why did you decide to come to Paraguay? Like, you're from Australia? Wow, like who would come from Australia to Paraguay? Like, they completely underestimate their own country, and they're kind of just happy that people are moving here. So I hope it stays like that as long as possible. Yeah, but it's definitely like that now.
Okay, yeah, we're probably shooting ourselves in the foot here by talking about it, but
I
hey,
know, like, I invite people to come to Paraguay. Generally, like, if I've when I'm talking to a potential client, if they're not the right fit and I don't think that'd be good for Paraguay, I like try and get rid of them, because yeah, the last thing I want is to ruin Paraguay by having like low quality, expats here. Right.
100%. And
So
yeah, and anyone who has a Twitter or X account can very quickly determine that there are certain other places in Latin or South America that, yeah, it's just been overrun by expats, and it's not my vibe personally. I've been to a lot of those places. I really like that. Historically, the Spanish and the Guarani people never had any really big dust ups, so there's no animosity between the local people. There's no historical hang-ups, let's say, because in most other countries in that area, there's quite a bit of animosity around that.
yeah, there's no, at least to the extent, there's no, like, oh, the colonizers, the this, the that vibe. And I think it's because, at least in Paraguay, obviously other countries were worse, there wasn't real that war, that real sort of yeah, just real conflict between the Spanish and the local people here.
Yeah, I think that it's funny how that can, as you're describing, transcend through the generations. And unfortunately, the opposite is true. If you have had a nasty history, that also gets carried on through the generations. Let's talk about average wage per month for a Paraguayo, and then what you would need in order to comfortably live in Paraguay, and local currencies, weather. Let's just talk the day-to-days, and whatever comes to mind after that, my friend, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I like how you say Paraguay show. It makes me think you've spent time in Argentina.
Guilty. I'm working
Yeah,
on
yeah,
I'm
because that's
working on
the
diminishing that
Argentinian.
accent.
Yeah, you got the show going on. That's pretty cool. Um, okay, so yeah, and that's another thing I like to talk about with potential clients, right? So, and just also just in general, yeah. So the average Paraguayan wage, let's say for a year, is about 9,000 US dollars, right? Obviously, a little bit more in Asuncion, a little bit less in the interior. Now, just because a Paraguayan earns 9,000 US dollars, let's say your online business is only earning 9,000, don't come here. Yeah. Like, Paraguayans can do it, they're pretty happy. But if you're used to living in a first world country, it'll be a little bit of a step down. I recommend to clients at least be earning like 18,000 US dollars a year. Then you can come here, you can be comfortable. But yeah, in terms of cost of living, it's funny, right? Because I left Australia, the West, before the whole inflation that's been going on. Like, in the last couple of years, inflation's been nuts. Yeah, so I'm sure it's even worse now. But in general, I would say in Paraguay, you pay about a third of what you would be paying, back home. And then there's two different classes. So, like, goods and services, well, goods that are imported are going to cost the same in Paraguay as they do in the States, right? So if you're going to get some Nike Air Jordans, an iPhone, Xbox, whatever you want, it's going to cost maybe the same 10% more in Paraguay. But any good that's produced in the local economy is going to be much, much cheaper. Yeah, so we're talking about your rent, electricity, your internet, your mobile phone, like eating out, and the best stuff, like things like your housekeeper or your Spanish lessons or anything like that. It's going to be much, much cheaper. For example, in Paraguay, like I mentioned before, the roads can get a bit hectic when everyone's living their free life. So I don't drive here. I just catch Ubers everywhere, yeah. And an Uber is like, the average one is like $3 US. Yeah, whereas in Australia, if I was to put it in US dollars, it'd probably be like 15 US dollars equivalent in Australia to catch an Uber around.
Oh my God, don't even start me on Uber in Melbourne, man. It's daylight robbery.
Yeah. And, and then one of the, like, if you follow us on Twitter, you know, what we really like to emphasize is steak. Yeah. So Paraguay is known as a really huge producer of beef. That's one of the main exports here. Like you go into the countryside here, it's just pasture. It's just pasture and cattle for hours. Yeah. And like you get like a steak dinner, like a prime cut, and I'm talking about 13, 14 US dollars. You know, like the equivalent, the equivalent would probably be about 60 US dollars in Australia for the equivalent sort of meal. You know,
Okay.
like you can eat steak, prime steak every day of the week here, you know, and that's definitely one of the cheapest products relative to the rest of the world.
And they're normally like 400-gram cuts, like 450-gram, or at least in Argentina. They're in Australia, you get like a
Yeah.
250, 300-gram. And
No, they go big here. Yeah,
yeah,
I like to, like when a client comes here, I always like to get them the tomahawk. You know, like a big old tomahawk, like just ridiculously big, too much steak, and yeah, it's always a good welcome.
excellent. Okay. And in terms of the weather, I assume it varies depending on where you are in the country, right? But in Asuncion, is it a humid place, dry place,
Mm.
hot? Do you have four seasons, or is it more of an equatorial vibe? What are we
Yeah.
talking weather-wise?
So we are south enough to have seasons, but I would say it's the climate sort of varies between hot and very hot. Yeah. So I'm just going to do Celsius. Your audience can figure it out because I'm Australian. We do Celsius.
Please do. The
So
rest
like
of the
in the
world is
summer
barbaric.
here, what's that?
Fahrenheit is barbaric. Don't use that.
Yeah,
That's
like
for
come on,
civilized.
guys, like get with it. You'll get like a week of like 38, 38, 38, 38 in the summer. Yeah. So the summer here is pretty warm. So what I recommend, like all my clients, what I do, I'm in a nice air-conditioned apartment. You work inside of your business during the day. Then, you know, at night, that's when you can come out. So the summer here is quite warm. And if there's ever a time of the year where people leave Paraguay, it's during the summer. The other months, you know, they're more mild. You know, winter's quite nice. You know, I'd say mid 20s throughout that, but the summer's pretty warm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So
sorry to interrupt, but to
yeah, go
clarify,
ahead.
the in terms of calendar months, when's the summer and when's the winter? Are we talking like
Yeah, so it's in the southern hemisphere. So summer is over Christmas, and then the winter's in the middle of the year.
okay, well, just like Australia.
Yeah, we're gonna have a hot Christmas just like back home.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, and then in terms of air conditioning and utilities and all that sort of stuff, is the standard if I go to Paraguay and I get an Airbnb, do I really
Yeah.
need to investigate like in other parts of the world, or is it pretty safe to have? I'm going to have my basics, my electricity, hot, cold water, heating, cooling, or particularly cooling in this case. What's the standard of, I guess?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I would say with like an Airbnb, right? Like Paraguayans aren't hiring Airbnbs. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So if there's an Airbnb, they know it's for foreigners, they know it's for expat, there's going to be a standard. Uh, I doubt you'd find an Airbnb without aircon here. If you are, you've done something wrong. You've gone way too cheap. So yeah, but definitely if you're coming here, get some aircon going. You don't want to miss out on that.
Okay. And for your clients and your friendship groups, how did they start in terms of getting a feel for the country? Is it like a lot of people, and myself included, I've done
Mm.
this, where you get your Airbnb for a month, and then while you're in that month, you get a feel for the place, and you're looking at potentially getting a longer term rental. In Argentina, for instance, you literally go on Facebook, certain groups, and they have the advertised prices, and that works really well. Do you need
Yeah.
a local realtor to help you out in Paraguay? What's the situation in terms of having confidence in a longer term rental once you decide that it's for you?
Yeah, so what I did and what I recommend is, and it sounds like you did the similar, is when you first come to Asuncion or whatever, just book like 2 weeks in an Airbnb in one suburb and another suburb. Do it 2 or 3 times until you feel what you like. Yeah. In general, hold on, Ben, have I
No, no.
recommend to people is come to Paraguay, rent 2 weeks in an Airbnb in a few different locations, and you'll get a feel of what parts of the city that you like. General, we have a part of the city that's kind of the new development. It's where expats live. It's where you can just get by without having a car. You can walk everywhere. And generally, everyone is most happy living there. But I agree, it's a good idea to look around a bit. For rentals, you can get a short-term rental. Like a lot of the high-rise apartment buildings, you can go and talk to reception, and they might let you do a couple months. You can just pay them directly. But generally, if you want to sign a lease, you'll go through a real estate agent. The usual length of a lease is about 1 year. What they will do, though, which is kind of interesting, is because as an expat, we don't really have a credit history or an income history in Paraguay, they'll usually make you pay 3 months in advance. So for my lease, I pay 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months. Yeah, so you can kind of expect that. In terms of the average price in sort of a nice area where most expats want to live, usually it's around 500 to 1,000 US dollars a month is what you can expect to pay.
Okay, well, that seems reasonable. And I presume in this case, we're talking apartments. Is that correct?
Yeah, so generally, I recommend first get an apartment. So Paraguay is it's a relatively safe country, but you got to realize there's so few expats here. Yeah, so if you're in some residential house in the middle of nowhere, just know everyone knows that's the only gringo there. Does he have any money? The fence isn't that big. If you're going to do it, make friends with all your neighbors so they're all watching your back. That's how they do it in the suburbs here. The neighbors know each other, they watch each other's back. You're a little bit vulnerable until you're Paraguay, sort of moving into that situation. You're much better, nice, modern high-rise. There's a guy at the door, there's the gym, there's the pool, and it's a lot simpler to adjust to Paraguayan life.
Yeah, very wise words. And to lead into the segue of real estate, if let's say I move there, I do my initial taste test, let's call it, in those high-rise apartments with the concierge, and then I think, you know what, there's a finca up the road, or there's a nice house here. I want to buy this thing outright. Can I do that as an expat? What are the options? Do I get finance? How much is this going to cost for, say, a 4-bedroom house? Run me through that idea. A lot of people have got that idea as the dream. Let's
yeah. Yeah, so let's go through that. So what is nice about the Paraguay and even the temporary residency is just how much sort of rights that you get connected to that, right? So you are able to purchase and own real estate land with just a temporary residency. So you don't have to worry about that. In regards to financing, it's unlikely that a bank here is going to give you a loan just as a random expat. And if they do, it's going to be an interest rate you don't want to pay. Yeah. So if you're going to buy something here, most likely you'd buy outright. The deals are usually in US dollars. That's just how it is here. Now, in terms of the cost, I mean, how long is a piece of string? I would say as an investment, Asuncion as a city is modernizing very quickly. It's growing quickly. I would probably buy that residential house that I said I was maybe a little bit too afraid to live in myself. I feel like that would be the good investment because there's a bit of land there. There's definitely suburbs that are poorer suburbs now, but are gentrifying quickly. And I think there'd be a good investment potential there. I reckon you'd pay for, let's say, it was a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom, 80 to 100,000 US dollars. If you go a little bit further out, so that's something that you could look at.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
is
that
the local currency? Is there a local Paraguayan currency in addition to the USD? What's the local currency?
The local currency is called the Guarani, the same name as the language and the local people. The exchange rate is currently roughly 7,200 Guarani is $1, which can be harder, especially when you're learning Spanish, right? Because something might cost, 548,000 Guarani, yeah? And they're telling you this huge, word in Spanish. You have no idea what's going on. So that takes a little bit of adjustment. but it is actually a fairly stable currency. Like if you look at guarani versus the US dollar, say over the last 10 years, like a lot of Latin American currencies are just tanked. Here, the government doesn't really print much. It's not like doing bailouts. It's not going into debt. And for that reason, the currency's been fairly stable. Now, I'm not saying put your life savings in guarani, right? Not financial advice, like you said, but I'm just saying it's compared to other currencies, it's quite stable. And that is a reflection of the policies of the government here.
Yeah. Okay. So all the major hyperinflations were a long way in the past, and since that, I'm not sure when the last dictator in Paraguay was, but I'm guessing that since they've kind of embraced this sort of free market democratic society, there, what do you know? Fiscal responsibility means you don't have to tank your currency, and there've been less wars. So I'm sensing a theme here across history. In terms of currency, do you need to take a stack of bills with you? USD will be okay. Physical cash, like in Argentina, is all about the billetes. But in Brazil, for instance, it's totally digitalized. Yeah. What's the digital payment structure like in Paraguay?
So it's pretty interesting. I would say roughly 50%, like, I don't know the exact number, okay? But it's roughly 50% of Paraguayans are unbanked, yeah? And so it kind of has this interesting thing where they're almost, the country's kind of like naturally resistant to like, you know, a central bank digital currency or anything like that, right? Because these people don't even have a debit card. You know, they're not going to get some CBDC wallet, you know, that's not happening anytime soon. And so people have like a lot of people have these little kiosks, like let's say they want to pay their bills or do something, rather than having a bank account, they just have cash and they'll go to these kiosks and they'll use those to pay bills, that sort of thing, right? So in terms of digitalization in general, it's pretty low. That said, you can use, like I use foreign debit cards here, you know, connected to my phone, just PayWave, that's fine, that works completely. You do need a little bit of a cash. Like, for example, I pay my cleaner in cash, you know, sort of like if you're buying some street food, you're going to pay in cash, right? But anyone that's coming here, you can basically just come here. You don't need any cash. Maybe get like a couple $100 out from the ATM in cash, just so you have a little bit on you. Just use your debit card and that'll be fine. It doesn't have the restrictions in Argentina, you know, with the weird dollar blue rate and all that, and going to talk to some guy in a dark alley to get some pesos, like that always stresses me out in Argentina. You have to find the dodgy guy to change immediately. Like you here, you can freely exchange money. That's not a problem. A little bit of a drawback of Paraguay, though, is that the banks here aren't great, right? So a couple years ago, the old president and the US kind of didn't see eye to eye on things. And the US accused, you know, the president of like being a money launderer and all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And so what they did to kind of punish Paraguay is they said, listen, the banks here have to follow all these really stringent rules or we're going to cut you off from SWIFT. Yeah, and obviously everyone needs to be part of SWIFT, so the banks capitulated. And so how it turns out today is if you have a Paraguayan bank account, if you transfer more than $1,000 a month into those bank accounts, they're going to ask you for source of funds. You know, you're going to have to show them a pay slip, an invoice, like maybe like where you traded your stocks, that sort of thing. And then some sources of funds they don't accept. So even though I'm a crypto guy, like I can't just sell, like say some Bitcoin on Binance and transfer the money into a bank account here. The banks here won't accept them. So I always recommend clients that love Paraguay, but get banking set up in other parts before you come to Paraguay.
Okay, so if you have an international bank and then you do your transfer to your international debit card or one of those borderless.
Yeah. So usually what I'll do, like let's say if I'm just with crypto, right? Say from Binance or Kraken to an international bank account, and I'll use that as my everyday card in Paraguay. I find that's the simplest way to go about it.
My friend, we're coming up on the hour. We have covered a lot of territory. I think we've put together a good little illustration of Paraguay. Is there anything I've
Yeah.
missed? Is there anything you would like to talk about that I forgot to ask?
Well, you know what? We got to talk about the other side of the coin, right? So
Let's do it.
I've just been saying nice things. So we do have to say some things that, could be better, right? Because we've got to give people a realistic opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so I just had a few things I call it the cons. So I would say in Paraguay, there's very little taxes. And so how that can relate to is that public services, particularly infrastructure, isn't great. So the roads here are pretty rough. You see like the power lines like above the ground here that can be a little bit ugly. So coming from like Australia, very high taxes, but the roads in Australia are beautiful. Here it's the opposite, right? Like
Clearly,
they're
you
a little
haven't
bit
been on the
rough.
Hume Highway recently, bro. There are
All
there are some
right.
potholes.
Okay, things have
Sorry, go
changed.
ahead.
Yeah. So that's something you have to get used to. I find Paraguay is like 90% developing in places and then 10% these super new like buildings, right? So it's kind of that interesting contrast. We mentioned the weather. Um, the government's very good. Sometimes there can be a little bit of corruption, so it usually won't affect you directly like day to day, but if you need something done, sometimes you have to need to know a person and then they take care of it for you. And that's just how business is done here sometimes, which is a little bit unfortunate. And then finally, like, and this is true for Latinos in general, but particularly Paraguayans. I love the Paraguayan people, the nicest people. But if you're expecting someone that's going to rock up on time or even 30 minutes late, this is the wrong people. Like Paraguayan punctuality is a little bit different. And so, like in the West, I find like we're happy just to give someone the bad news, like a yes or no, we're direct. They can be very friendly and sometimes they can be sugar coated. There's a few white lies, so they might say they're going to do something and it doesn't get done. So I think that's why also our business is pretty successful, because we sort of have that Western level of reliability, even though we're in Paraguay. Whereas if you deal with a Paraguayan, sometimes it's not quite like that.
Okay. Well, that gives us a balanced look at both sides of the coin. Let's talk about Plan B Paraguay. What services do you offer? How do people get in contact with you? Obviously, those details will be in the video description. And who is it that you can really help, and who is it that you're not looking for?
Right, yeah. So obviously our main business is the residency service. So effectively we help you get the residency, and then as well as that, we like to think of ourselves as kind of your Paraguayan life coach, right? Because it's one thing to get a residency, but then what do you need? Like we help our clients with their bank accounts, with insurance, driver's licenses, right, renting and buying real estate, like legally obtaining firearms, just like any sort of issue you're going to have in Paraguay, we'll help you with that, right? Because the whole idea with this business is I came here, I love the country, but I struggled a lot because I didn't understand it. So I wanted the next person to come. I'd be like, dude, this is what you need. Go here, do this. You're going to have a good time, and that's what we try and provide for our clients. The right client, like I said, this is going to be my home, right? So I want to bring high quality clients here. So as long as they're respectful of Paraguay, they're a good person, it'll be a good fit. Obviously, there is financial consideration. So like I said, don't come here if you only have $1,000 in your bank account. Like build yourself up, make some money online, do what you got to do before you come here, right? So I'd say that would be the main thing. And also, Paraguay kind of is like the frontier. It's like the jungle. It's the Wild West, right? So when you come here, you're looking after yourself. Like you have a good group of guys that'll watch out for you, but there's no one coming to save you. It's not like in Australia where you can sort of act like a bit of a retard and get away with it. Like you won't get away with it in Paraguay.
The music to the ears of every maverick around the world. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. You tried to masquerade as a government employee, but I know that deep down you, sir, are a maverick. Thank you very much for joining me, Paul, on what I hope will be one of many discussions we shall have in the future. Next year, I hope to have a nice steak dinner with you in Asuncion. Thank you, viewers and listeners, very much for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode of The Maverick Life shortly. Thanks, guys. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.